welcome to the Archiver panel. As Kevin said, we'll talk a little bit about Archiver as a project, just to set the scene and provide some context so you're oriented, especially for those of you who don't know much about Archiver, haven't come across the project before. About 20-25 minutes of Q&A within the panel, and then we'll open to the floor for questions. So, João, would you like to talk a little bit about Archiver?
Okay, so yes, so Archiver, you might have heard about Archiver, CERN, private sector, public sector preservation, what have we done. So back in 2019, a long time ago, right? What happened was that in spite of having several activities for archiving digital preservation across the communities, and when I say across the communities, there are several, as you know much better, in Earth observation, in energy physics, and other domains. There were some gaps identified in how to have services that could serve these communities at large or in a coherent way. So, and the gaps were technical sometimes, and when I talked about technical gaps, I talk about infrastructure, so petabyte scale infrastructure for high energy physics data sets and life science data sets, for example. A lot of bit preservation capabilities, but not a lot of preservation capabilities. Okay. Then organizational. So as you probably know, there's a lot of data that CERN produces. There's a lot of data that Hemble produces. Not all that data is published. Not all that data is made open as it should to researchers. And then always the very important factor, the cost planning of all this. When you enter in a preservation journey, how much are you going to have to allocate, and how much are you going to spend in X years for these services to be available. So that was the motivation of the Archiver project. And the different thing from other R&D projects probably that you heard about is not a research and innovation action as it is with CERN and EMBL and PIC and DESI representing different sciences and companies, but is a competitive R&D process, and that's where the stress starts. So what I mean with competitive is we had 3 phases of implementation. So we had an architectural phase where we selected 5 designs, 5 architectures. We eliminated 2. We then went to a prototype phase where we had 3 prototypes, and our technical people deployed together with the experts from the companies present data sets. And of course, we had a decision by the end of the prototype phase eliminating 1. And then we have a pilot phase where is the last stage of the project. And we have the production services that are now available. So I have to say that this type of R&D is something that CERN does very much. So normally, so by default, we always build everything. Okay, in the last 30 years, CERN builds infrastructure because sometimes we could not find this available in public. The difference now in the last 10, 15 years is, of course, we start to have companies and we start to have the private sector that can, with a little push, probably cope with the requirements of big science. And so this was one of the cases in preservation. We saw there were some companies already with a very good baseline, probably not at 20 petabyte, but probably already at 1 or 2 petabyte, probably not doing all these scientific domains, but doing already 1 or 2. And so with a little push, there are 2 benefits. You get production services based on SMEs in Europe and UK. And then these services can also serve other sciences that are not only the ones that were represented in Archiver. I'll stop here and you can...
Perfect. Sounds like a good point to ask ourselves some questions. So the first question, and these questions are designed to sort of explore the Archiver story and the pros and cons of the approach that Archiver took. So the first question is, what were the main challenges in Archiver and how were they overcome? Were they organizational, technological, economic, or some mix? So I'm going to randomly pick on Theo to answer that one first.
I wasn't expecting that. Yeah, it's a bit, as João has just introduced, it's a combination of different things. It's not only the technology, it's also the organizational impact, how different departments also in the complexities of the different members of the buyers group and the different priorities that are in there. So everything has to be taken into consideration. as a complete set. So I would say that in our perspective, everything comes together. So everything is part of the whole picture.
Yeah, I just want to add that apart from all this organizational, technical, economics, there was also in this particular project, the challenge of putting two communities talking with each other, the preservation community. I'm not from the preservation community, I'm from the IT community, so the preservation community and the IT community. And I think what we achieved as a milestone in this project was having these companies acting as translators of what the important requirements are for each one of the communities, because I think both of them are important, and the real challenge and the real benefit is when you manage to combine both together, I think.
Yep, I'll answer the question as well. I just want to pick up on 2 points. I mean, the technical point, it was an R&D project and it was extremely challenging. So, for example, one of the targets was to be able to ingest and store 100 terabytes of research data a day. That kind of felt like one of those DARPA grand challenges about autonomous vehicles having to drive across America. It felt really hard at the beginning, but actually we achieved it in the project. And I think that's an example of how actually quite big projects which are well funded can really push the state of the art further than maybe incremental changes that might happen in the community in the isolation. The other interesting thing I think about Archivo was also its multi-stage approach. So João talked about this, the fact that it was 3 stages and there was a little competition between each stage and the vendors were eliminated during this process. So 15 vendors started, 2 vendors finished. That's very different from a sort of traditional RFP contract, one vendor, you're stuck with them for 3 years. This was get everyone involved, do something small, weed it down, pick what works, go to the next one. And that, I think, is a really interesting approach that differentiates Archivo from a lot of what we normally see in the community. Massively.
Not at all. You remember Hunger Games? Similar.
But worse, yeah. Second question. So what worked well in Archivo when the suppliers and end users collaborated together using the project's pre-competitive R&D approach? And do you think this could be a good template for other sectors? João, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so from our perspective, what worked well was this dialogue for the R&D production, okay, from the beginning. So I think one of the main achievements was that we managed to find a common terminology at some point, because not only they have different scientific domains, but we also have the public sector and the private sector. Not all of them talk the same languages, the same technical languages all the time. So that was the first part. And I think, yeah, so if I can say what was the real good thing that I saw progress based on this dialogue and based on this agile development that we maintain, both of us, the private companies in the project, and a lot of work, but a very good way to develop or to reduce this R&D, I think.
Yeah, I'll pick the question next and I'll hand over to Theo. So I kind of agree with that. It was a really good collaborative, iterative project, and there was a lot of trust and transparency between the buyers and the vendors, and that enabled us to work really well together. As well as being an R&D project, so there was an acceptance that some things wouldn't work and there'll be failures along the way, and I think that was quite a positive thing, that we could try things, it failed, you try something else, and eventually you iterate to a solution. So yes, I definitely think that approach could work elsewhere. I mean, coupled with the large scale of Archivo, I think that's a useful model for sort of grand challenges or looking for big advancements, especially across a set of vendors.
Yeah, to that, I would add one thing that I want to stress. In this discovery journey, there was a lot of co-development, so there was a lot of dialogue, regular meetings, weekly meetings, and then some additional meetings. And also we played along the consortium strengths. We built a consortium with very diverse knowledge being put together for the better understanding of the problems, suggesting solutions, testing things, finding failures, and then remove those failures for a successful result.
Cool. So the third question, what are the three most important features of each of the archiver resulting solutions? So the things that the vendors have built. How did the end users articulate their priorities, and how did the suppliers go about building their solution? So I'll go first as from one vendor point of view. Let's just Teo goes next, and then João can disagree with us and say we didn't actually do what we were meant to have done. But so I think the three most important features from at least an archiving point of view, scalability and performance of our solution. So this whole 100 terabytes a day, petabyte data volumes. I won't go into the technical details of how we did that. I actually presented an iPres paper last year on that. So that drove us to build a very scalable solution. But we also had to be very efficient and cost-effective in the way that solution worked. And I think a spin-off benefit of that was the work that the project's done on environmental sustainability. So an important feature, I think, of our solution, and Libnova's as well, I'm sure, is the fact that the carbon footprint of doing these sort of big digital preservation, processing and storage jobs in the cloud is minimized as far as possible. And I don't think we would have done that unless we'd had Archiver as a big project with that sort of thing up on its agenda to push us in that direction. And then I think the third area is integration. So it's not just about preservation and archiving, it's about making data accessible and available and usable by things like scientific applications. So be able to co-locate applications and data together in one place to help archive content be used.
The performance issue is something that was at the forefront of the project. Also, the diversity of material, as João mentioned, several actors with several domain knowledge. They proved to be a challenge because not all the data sets were similar, so we have to handle this in a diverse way as well. And also the sustainability issue that Matthew just mentioned. In both respects, so there's a sustainability issue about future-proofing the development, and also the carbon footprint, which is more and more something that is being taken into consideration. And also one thing that we discovered phase 2 to phase 3, and then we strengthened our consortium, was about cybersecurity. This is a main concern everywhere, not only the data privacy, but also vulnerabilities that could be happening, especially in sensitive research areas, which is something to consider.
You know, I think you touched most of the aspects. What we have done in the beginning between CERN, EMBL, DESI, and PIC in Spain was to bring use cases representative across different domains. Okay, so CERN brought the LHC, of course, the energy physics use cases, because that's our core business. DESI brought the proton science use cases in Germany. PIC brought the astrophysics from the MAGIC telescope in Canary Islands. And EMBL brought the life sciences, everything that relates to genome research. So I think the three, if you ask me, the three common, probably there are more, but the three common aspects here, and also a bit with my CERN hat, is we had a more or less pure preservation use case with digital memory, so the digital memory of CERN, okay, so it's more on the traditional use cases of preservation, but then we had what is part of our mission, that is the open data use case. So the open data use case is realistically having engines that are independent of CERN infrastructure that will allow researchers, theorists in the MIT, theorists in Harvard that could reproduce the analysis and the scientific analysis that took place at CERN or are taking place at CERN. So if I list the three, so scale, reproducibility, and then the third one that is very important for the public sector is the cloud agnosticity or deployment model agnosticity. Okay, so because we will have on the research, on the European research landscape, we have organizations that will be on-prem all the time. We'll have organizations that will have an hybrid model with cloud provider, but the common requirement is to be able to detach from certain infrastructure and be able to deploy in another infrastructure. So in this, I think both Archivum and Libnova made a very good work on this.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point about lock-in both to cloud vendors or actual digital preservation vendors. Yep. Fourth question. So Archiver has done a lot of work on technological solutions, but what about the economics and the business models? What commercialization approaches do the Archiver team foresee for the resulting services from the project? João, maybe you want to go first.
Yeah, I can go first. So I talked about a pre-commercial procurement that was the nature of this action, not a research and innovation action. Why? Because for us it was important already from the beginning that how these services are going to be sustained after the end of the project. It's a requirement that started. Okay, so right now we have services that are ready. Okay, and so most of the organizations involved in Archiver, and when I say most of the public sector organizations, are the full buyers because they had put the funds for the development, but also we have a set of early adopters across different domains that are also entitled to buy these services now with no, let's say, cycles of procurement in addition because they were part of the project. But that is only one part of it, okay? The second aspect that I forgot to mention from the beginning is that we have been co-funded by the EC, the European Commission, because they did see that the potential for these services was not only for the organizations that were participating in the project, but more widely on the European landscape of research. So, and these services are published in what we call the marketplace of the European Open Science Cloud. So they are available now for other research organizations to purchase them if they want, to trial them if they want. And the next step, and it's a next step that we are working on, is to enable other research projects as an adoption, let's say, phase to adopt these services or to be funded to use these services for their research use cases in order to form a model that will be sustainable at the European level for all these services. Okay? It's not only for preservation services. In the Archiver case, it's for preservation services.
So thanks.
I'll let you some others.
Yeah.
I'll stop now.
A couple of things to add. Thanks to the project, we have created a full product that I believe is going to become a product line about research and data sets and all that, and not only covering public institutions. Right now, we already have deployed the resulting asset from the project in two universities, Oxford University here in the UK, and also University of New Mexico in America, and more are coming in these months. But also there's an interest from private research organizations, pharmaceutical companies, they generate lots of material, so they are showing an interest, and we're running some demos there. And also about the business models, I made just some notes. And the focus was about cloud computing. This is not the only case, but cloud computing really provides a lot of advantages. And we try to make the business model to be as cloud agnostic, but cloud-based as a priority.
From Archivum's point of view, similar position. I think we've commercialized, productized the work that we've done in Archiver. It's available in our product. It's cloud-hosted, software as a service, etc. I think that the questions for me is how this works for a wide range of organizations to make it sustainable. So we've got the really big guys in Archiver, the buyers, people like CERN, but there's the whole long tail of science and the smaller organizations. So how do you produce a solution that works for both the big guys and maybe they help support the big infrastructure, the stacks that are run, and maybe it's you can piggyback the smaller guys on the top, and it's a marginal cost to add them, so the price to them is potentially low and affordable. So I think there's still quite a lot of work to be done there. And there's also work, I think, to be done to clarify who pays. and the money flows, right? So, how do we get beyond the traditional grant-funded research project where the funding doesn't pay for the data to live on afterwards? How does that flow into these long-term sustainable services? So lots of things, I think, still to explore around business models. But from a product point of view and a technology point of view, we're kind of there, I think. It's available for people to use. Okay, so the fifth and final question before we open it up to the floor. Do you think that the lessons learnt and the solutions developed in Archiver are transferable from Archiver to other disciplines and domains? What would be your number one recommendation? So I shall pick on myself to answer that one first. So yes, I think the results of Archiver are transferable. It's not just the solutions, they're not specifically built for scientific data, they can be used in other sectors. What I think is not the end result of the project, but how we got there, this whole multi-phase, iterative approach to converging on a solution between the buyers and the vendors. And I think that's where there's opportunity to replicate that model elsewhere, especially for some of the maybe bigger or more challenging aspects of digital preservation. So it's the process, I think, that's important. So iteration, openness, transparency, flexibility. Try it, and it's okay to fail. Try again and keep iterating. So it's that sort of agile approach that I think, along with a healthy injection of cash from the European Commission, that helped Archiver produce the results that it has.
Yeah, no, I don't know if you want to. So, okay, I'll be fast this time. So I think, I fully agree. The R&D process, at least me, myself, having experience of other EC projects as well, other R&D projects funded by DC, it's very healthy because you are developing with a defined objective by the end of the project, having something that is going to be usable and can be distributed for more people. So it's not there's no cloud on the objectives. I think we can optimize it. So two things. The project should focus more on R&D than on the procurement part, but unfortunately the procurement is still very heavy. So if we manage to let's say reduce the complexity of this process, I think we'll gain. And so I think apart from this process, the part that should be put also more effort on is what happens after the end of the project, because yes, these buyers can buy, but how can we make these services now available for more people to buy them in a let's say structured way? Right.
Yeah, just picking on what I mentioned before, we did detect interest when we were in the initial development stages of the project. We did detect the interest from somewhere outside the public funded institutions, research institutions. So the project has been a good starting point to get the technology in place, but also, as we mentioned, to be flexible enough to address different sectors, different technologies, different amounts, and different complexities in there. And just one recommendation is planning. Everything comes to planning ahead, and of course, having a generous budget helps a lot.
Cool. Staggeringly, we managed to keep to time, I think. So I think we've got good 15 minutes left for questions. Do you guys want to questions online or take questions from the floor? I'll let you guys sort of moderate it, please.
So we haven't got any online at the moment, so but I'm sure there are some in the room. Yeah.
Some hands up, that's a relief.
There's Simon here.
Hello, can you hear me? Simon Wibley, British Library. I just wanted to dig down a bit more into the consortia to try and understand and get my head around it a bit. So was there clear areas of responsibility for Archivum and for LibNova to work on, or was it a true crossover where you were dealing on roughly the same kind of areas of concern and development between you jointly?
Okay, so there wasn't collaboration between the vendors.
Stress.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of stress and quite a lot of competition at times. So the buyers essentially set the same problem, if you like, to each of the vendors. So here are the use cases for high energy physics, astronomy, and so on. These are sort of requirements. This is the scale you need to work at, and then the consortia, so LibNova led one, Archivum led another, then went away to build those solutions sort of iteratively. So each of us individually talked to the buyers and went through this iterative process, but because certainly the first few phases of Archiver were competitive, there was no talking between the vendors, right? There was nothing given away at that point. So it's quite an interesting and quite a brutal process to go through.
Remember what I said about Hunger Games?
Yeah.
Just picture yourself. No, just to add to that is, I mean, the overall rules were clear, so we have to comply. And right now you see only the two of us, but at the beginning it was more competitive consortium, and everyone was trying to do their best in that respect. And the common point was the buyers group, which is CERN, DESI, PIC, and EMBL. So we have a lot of interaction with the buyers group because they were setting the rules and the things that they wanted to do.
Yeah, so if I can add, just to give you some numbers, we have 15 consortia applying, okay, bidding for R&D. The rules are quite clear and quite well defined, so you cannot have, for example, a member of the consortium that is on the buyer's client side and on the supplier side, because there is an evident conflict of interest. So you have many organizations in Europe that sometimes have a double role, so you cannot do this. And then there is a very defined responsibility for the head of consortium, that it was, in this case, the software company that was leading the R&D, that then can have on their consortium other companies to help or to complement the solution that they are building. Okay.
Yep. Go for it.
You're clearly dealing with massive amounts of data. You've talked about the importance of cost effectiveness. Were you able to drive down the sort of per terabyte storage cost associated with this amount of data? I'm thinking particularly of digitized AV, which is maybe not as massive what's coming out of CERN, but is quite large and a big challenge for cultural heritage organizations to afford being able to sort of preserve these big giant AV files.
Go first.
So our solution was deployed on Google Cloud Platform, and it has multiple classes or tiers of storage, so standard, nearline, cold line, and archive. And as you go down the tiers, the cost of storage decreases down to the order of sort of $10 to $20 per terabyte per year. So the approach was to, identify what data is frequently accessed and needs to be on higher tiers, what data is sort of large and cold and can be pushed down to lower tiers, and try and optimize the distribution of different types of data across different tiers to try and minimize the overall cost. On top of that comes the usual digital preservation, multiple copies in different geographic locations, fixity checks, potentially across multiple cloud providers, or if you're deploying on-prem, it's on-prem and cloud, and that just expands out the cost again. So we did look at approaches to minimizing some of that. So not necessarily pulling back every file every 3-6 months and doing fixity checks, but relying on what the underlying cloud provider already does to try and reduce some of the longer term costs.
Yeah, we use Amazon Web Services. We have a partnership with them, and it's just the same. You have the different tiering approach, and depending on what you use and what the actual system, we implemented kind of intelligent approach. So some things that are not frequently accessed can be removed. But this is, right now, this is the responsibility of the researcher or the research group that is responsible for that. And one of the things that we haven't mentioned is we are talking about cloud, but one part of interest in the project was also demonstrate that on an on-prem deployment. So you can use either one, the other, or a combination, as Matthew just said, 1 copy, 2 copies, 3 copies, just for security that you are preserving and really guaranteeing that you can get access to that. So that was also part of the overall demonstration of the project.
I'll pick on one extra point on that. It's not just about storage, it's also about what you do and how often you access the content. And so the strategy in Archiver, certainly for the cloud deployments, was you don't want to take the content out of the Archiver and ship it over a network and process it somewhere else, for example, in reproducibility of scientific experiments. So the approach is to move the applications and co-locate them with the data in the cloud to minimize the movement of data and egress charges and other associated costs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I could add something, but that's fine.
You can go next. You can go first on the next question.
Do you want to add something?
No, it's fine, that's fine.
All right, let's go to Paul then.
Yeah.
I'm sure it will come.
Oh,
again.
sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Hi, David Millman, NYU. I'm curious about, sorry if I don't know how the project design was organized in the first place, but I'm happy to see that the preservation vendors were participating and that's the space in which you narrowed it down. But from our experience, and we're happy to be working with these preservation vendors all the time and realize that they're not apples to apples vendors. I mean, the features that are offered by them don't align exactly. And so how do you know that was the vendors who have identified themselves as preservation vendors, how do you know those were the right ones to solicit? Or maybe did you need a business networking vendor that does the financial industry?
I hope they were the right ones, but no, I mean for this pre-commercial procurement, the process is quite straightforward and established. So you need to collect the requirements of all the areas that these vendors are going to develop against. Remember, it's not a procurement of commodity. We are not asking for a product that exists. You are asking for a product that will exist by the end of the project with our help, essentially, or with our validation and our stress injection. So the tender is made in a way that they get marks across what they intend to develop to reach the given requirement. Okay, so this gives, of course, some margin of let's say of doubts to understand if the company that replied to this given tender is capable of what they are doing, they're saying they are going to be doing or not. And this is why you have a first phase that will be a design phase, where from the design you see immediately if those requirements are being covered enough. Okay, then you have the second, let's say, filter is when you ask them to deploy. And so it's there that you see, okay, is the petabyte capability there, software-wise and infrastructure-wise, with a contract that can do it? Is all the preservation expertise inside this consortium in order to have what we're missing in terms of how to ensure these preservation workflows? So to reply to your question, is a continuous process. So it's not a one-shot process that you make a contract and then, oh my God, what did I do? Is more or less like you do a process. Oh my God, what did I do? Okay, eliminate. Oh my God, what did I do? I eliminate, and now we have something that works. Okay.
That absolutely worked, and thankfully we weren't eliminated. The other thing about, if you're going to compare apples to oranges, one approach is to use things like standards, frameworks, assessment models, metrics, and so on. So within the project, each of the solutions or the vendors were asked to map the capabilities of their solutions to Core Trust Seal, DPC, RAM. I think you did ISO 16363, so TDR. There's also the recent Core Trust Seal meets FAIR and the metrics and that. So that provides some way of then comparing the capabilities of the two solutions because they've been mapped to some common framework. So that was done as well. So I just flagged that up as something, a useful output of the project.
And so just one thing I forgot, sorry. Of course, during the R&D process, there are checkpoints where we check the evolution of the R&D, okay, from a technical perspective. And then you add, and a bit on what has been discussed before, total costs of services, simulators, and self-assessments on everything that regards best practice for preservation. And so this is something that is continuously evaluated during the phases of the project.
That last statement sort of nicely segues into what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the process, in how you've got to where you are now. Obviously, you're close to the end of the process. What would you do differently if you did it again? And I'd like to have both sides of the equation here. I'd like to know what the vendors would have liked to have seen done that wasn't done.
Right, I'll have a stab at that. From a process point of view, over the 2 or more years that the vendors developed these solutions, there were these 3 phases of the project. So design, prototype, pilot. And 15 went into the first phase, or competed for the first phase. 5 were selected. Out of those 5, everyone competed for the next phase. 3 were selected, and then it went down to 2 for the final phase. And that was an absolutely brutal process. And it was also a nightmare from a SME point of view, because you get to the end of one phase, and there's like a 3-month window where you go through like a mini competition, put a proposal in, and you don't know whether you're going to be successful in the next phase. And you get told 1 month before the next phase starts that you've won, and you've suddenly got to turn on a tap and find like a team of 8 or 10 people to do the work. So on the one hand, that was really good, I think, from a buyer's point of view in terms of narrowing down the field. From a vendor's point of view, it was an absolute nightmare in terms of resourcing it and managing it and the uncertainties involved. So if there's one thing I would change, it would be to make that process easier from a vendor point of view. I don't disagree with the Hunger Games narrowing it down. It's just, it could have been made easier to operate.
Yeah, now just taking on that, the interim period between phase 1 and phase 2, and we were keeping on the work without knowing whether we were completed successfully phase 1 or whether we have the opportunity to go to phase 2. And that was really stressful on our resources, and because we wanted to keep going. And that was that caused some problems inside the company. That's something that I believe this is the way. This is a kind of funnel, step by step. But some additional transparency maybe would be good in the overall sense.
You can within a European project.
Yes. I mean, the European Commission, it works like that. So.
May I say something?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I keep cutting you off.
So I agree. Okay. I mean, one thing that we could do better, the buyers, I have to say, is be more precise on it would help the roadmap definition for R&D. So be more precise in the earlier stage of the project about all the requirements across these different use cases that were complicated. They were complicated even for people from the scientific side to understand what the use cases were from the other science side. Okay. So we could do better than that. And I think, and taking a bit towards Matthew, separating the processes of preparation and architecture and then implementation. So this would ease the brutality of the process and probably have a bit more time to prepare the implementation phases. That I agree, we had 4 months plus 6 plus 7. It's not a lot of time. And for software companies, they live in months and not in years like the public sector. So we need to find a way to mitigate this. Sorry.
A related but more general question. So Matthew, you mentioned using or applying agile methodology to the delivery of the project. Can you just back up a bit and say a bit more about what that is for people in the audience who don't know, and why that might be an approach to take for software delivery for, again, those in the audience thinking about building their own tools or software implementing vendor-created software?
Yeah, I mean, agile, I suppose, just means iteration. It just means on a relatively short timescale, define what you're going to do. In software development, it might be that, here's the target, you've got 2 or 3 works worth of development, did you meet it, what are you going to do next? And you go through this sort of agile cycle. And the project was similar to that on various scales, whether it was the overall project phases of design, prototype, pilot, when vendors were sort of narrowed down in each phase. That's sort of an iterative process. And then within each phase, there were, the buyers would specify, their requirements and prioritize them, and then the vendors would pick off some of those and start work on them for a few weeks, release a version of the software to the buyers that then they could test and play around with. In the meantime, the vendors would pick up the next few requirements and start adding those into the solution, and a few weeks later release another version. And so the buyers have always got something to play with and provide feedback on. The vendors have got a sort of a backlog of requirements, things to do. So you get this sort of cycle of vendors doing development iteratively, buyers evaluating solutions iteratively, and then feeding that back, so there's an overall loop.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Do you want to go ahead there?
Thank you. Maybe the obvious question for the buyers, are you going to buy one of those solutions? And maybe for the vendors, you've been doing a lot of R&D, working very closely with a number of big research players in Europe. Is this now part of your general market offering, or is it reserved to those 4?
Yeah. So for the buyers, after the end of the project, each buyer is acting independently. Okay, so each buyer has their own budgets and their own policies, and they will act independently with each of the contractors. Okay. On the case of CERN, what I can say is yes, there is evaluations going on from the results of the project that might result in contracts to be put in place. From the other buyers, I have the impression in some of them as well that's the case. Okay. Then the second part of the story is that these services will be available on the European Open Science Cloud, and there other buyers, not necessarily part of this consortia, can also buy these services. Okay.
From a vendor point of view, yes, it's already, the work that we've done in Archiver is already in our product, but it's still just the beginning of the journey. So when Paul said, are we nearly at the end or whatever, no, we're not. There's still so much more to go. So the European Open Science Cloud, I think the statistics are like 70 million researchers or staff use it across thousands of institutions within Europe, and it's $1 billion or euro scale funded. Right, so there's a huge market out there, and us as vendors, we've only just put our solution on that marketplace. There's just so much more to go in terms of adoption and take up and more iterations and further projects and more fun and Hunger Games.
I think that's a good note.
Just to add to that, we're
Very
already
quickly.
making money from that. So without the help of this accelerated way of development, we wouldn't be here. But we are just starting this journey, and we have customers that are already using and paying for our product. So thank you, Katie.
Well, speaking of hunger, it's now time for a break, so you can get a snack and a coffee. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.